Reading of Peter Pan, Chapter 3. Come away, come away. For a moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the bed of the three children continued to burn clearly. They were awfully nice little night lights, and one could not help wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also. And before they could close their mouths, all three went out. There was another light in the bedroom now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights. And in the time we had taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in all the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaging through the wardrobe, turning every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, because when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still glowing. It was a girl called Tinker Bell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf cut low and square, through which her figure could be seen to the best advantages. She was slightly inclined to have Bump's hourglass figure. A moment after the fairy's entrance into the window was blown open by the breathing of little stars, and Peter popped in. He carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with fairy dust. "Tinker Bell," he said softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for a moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug, and tell me, do you know where to put my shadow?" The loveliest tink of the golden bell answers him, and it's the fairy language. You ordinarily children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She met the chest of drawers, and Peter bumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands, and King tossed happenings to the crowd. In a moment he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut Tinker Bell up in a drawer. If he thought, but I don't believe he ever thought it was that he was his shadow, when brought near to each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but it also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy. She sat up in her bed. She was not alarmed to see the stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" Peter could be exceedingly polite, also having learned that the grand manner of fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautiful. She was much pleased and bowed beautifully back to him from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy." "Morel Angela Darling," she replied. Here's a picture. With some satisfaction, "What's your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it didn't seem a comparative short name. "Is that all?" "Yes," he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a short name. "I'm sorry," said Wendy Morel Angela. "It doesn't matter," Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right," said Peter, "and then straight on till the morning." "What a funny address!" Peter had a stinking. For the first time he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was his hostess. Is that what they put on the letters?" He wished she had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. "But your mother gets letters." "Don't have a mother," he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of tragedy. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you're crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said rather indignantly. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying. It had come off." "Yes." This Wendy saw that the shadow on the floor looking so draggedly, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she could not help smiling. When she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap, how exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. "It must be sewn on," she said, just a little patronizing. "What's sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "I'm not." But she was exulting in his ignorance. "I shall sew it on for you, my little man," she said. Though he was tall as her, she got out one of her sewing bags and she sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. "I dare say, will it hurt?" "A little," she warned him. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter, who was already the opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth and did not cry, and soon the shadow was behaving properly, though still a little ceased. "Perhaps I should have ignored it," Wendy said, thoughtfully, but Peter, boylike, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas! He had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached his shadow himself. "How clever I am!" he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me!" In his humiliating to have to confess that conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with the brutal frankness, there has never been a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. "You braggart!" she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "Of course, I did nothing." "You did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. "A little?" she replied with pride. "If I am no use, I can at least withdraw," and she sprang into the most dignified way into the bed and covered her face with the blankets. To induce her to look up and pretend to be going away, and with this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with the foot. "Wendy," he said, "don't withdraw." "I can't help quarreling, Wendy, when I am pleased with myself." Still she would not look up, though she was listening eagerly. "Wendy," he continued, in a voice that no woman had ever been able to resist. "Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys." Now Wendy was every inch a woman, though there was not very many inches, and she peeped out of the bedclothes. "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do." I think it's perfectly sweet of you," she declared, "and I'd get up again." And she sat with him on the side of the bed. She also said she would give him a kiss if he'd like, but Peter didn't know what she meant. And so he held out his hand expectantly. "Surely you know what a kiss is," she said. Aghast. "I shall know when you give it to me," he replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. "Now," he said, "I shall give you a kiss." And she replied with a slight primness, "If you please." She made herself rather cheap and inclined her face towards him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand. So she slowly turned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on a chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did put it on the chain, for it was afterwards to save her life. When people in our set are introduced, it is customary for them to ask each other age and so on. Wendy's, who's always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was. It was not really a happy question to ask him. It was like an examination paper as to grammar. When what you want to be asked is King of England. "I don't know," he replied uneasily, "but I am quite young." He really knew nothing about it. He had merely suspicions. And he said, at a venture, "Wendy, I ran away a day I was born." Wendy was quite surprised but interested, and she indicated in the charming drawer room manner by a touch on her nightgown that he could sit near her. "It was because I heard Father and Mother explaining in a low voice, talking about what I was to be when I became a man." He was extraordinarily elated now. "I don't ever want to be a man," he said with passion. "I want to always be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies." She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had ran away, but it was really because he knew fairies. Wendy had lived such a home life that to know fairies struck her as quite delightful. She pondered out questions about them to his surprise, for they were rather a nuisance to him, getting in his way and so on, and indeed, and sometimes having to give them a spanking. Still, he liked them on the whole, and he told her about the beginnings of the fairies. "You see, Wendy, when the babies first laughed for the first time, its laughs broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that's where the beginnings of fairies." Tediously talk thus, but being at a stay-at-home, she liked it. And so he went on for good nature. "There ought to be one fairy for every little boy and girl." "Ought to be, isn't there?" "No, you see, children know such a lot now that soon don't believe in fairies. And every time a child says, 'I don't believe in fairies,' there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead." Really? He thought that had now talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinkerbell was keeping very quiet. "I can't think where she had gone to," he said, rising, and he could talk Tink by name. Wendy's heart was fluttered with a sudden thrill. "Peter!" she cried, clutching him. "You don't mean to tell me that there's a fairy in this room?" "She was here just now," he said, a little impatiently. You don't hear her, do you?" And they both listened. "The only sound I heard," said Wendy, "is like a tinker of bells." "Well, that's Tink. That's the fairy language. I think I hear her too." "It sounds like it's coming from the Chester drawers." And Peter made a merry face. No one could ever look quite as merry as Peter. And the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. He had first laughed still. "Wendy," he whispered gleefully, "I do believe I shut her up in the drawer." He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery screaming with fury. "You shouldn't say such things," Peter retorted. "Of course I'm very sorry, but how could I have known you were in the drawer?" Wendy was not listening to him. "Oh, Peter," she cried, "if she would only stand still and let me see her." They hardly ever stand still," he said. But for one moment Wendy saw a romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. "Oh, how lovely!" she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. Tink said Peter admirably. "This lady says she wishes you were her fairy." Tinker Bell answered insolently. "What does she say, Peter?" He had translated. "She is not very polite. She says that you are a huge, ugly girl, and that she is my fairy." He tried to argue with Tink. "You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, 'cause I'm a gentleman and you're a lady." And to this Tink replied in the words, "You silly ass," and disappeared into the bedroom. "She is quite the common fairy," Peter explained apologetically. "She is called Tinker Bell because she mends the pots and kettles." Sorry about that. They were all together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy piled them in with more questions. "If you don't live in Kingston Gardens now." "Sometimes I still do." "But where do you live mostly now?" "With the Lost Boys." "Who are they?" "They're the children who fall out of their perambulansors when the nurses is looking the other way, and if they are not claimed in 7 days, then they're sent far away to Neverland to defray expenses, and I'm captain." "What fun it must be." "Yes," said Peter cunningly. "But we'd rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship." "Aren't none of the others girls?" "Oh, no, girls. You know, we're pretty. We're much too clever to fall out of their prams." This flattered Wendy immensely. "I think," she said, "it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John, they're just despise us." For reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of the bed, blankets and all. One kick. This seemed to Wendy rather a forward for the first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so practically on the floor, and she allowed him to remain there. "And I know you meant to be kind," she said, relenting, "so you may give me a kiss." For a moment she had forgotten his ignorance about kiss. "I thought you would want it back," he said, a little bitterly, "and often to return her the thimble." "Oh dear," said the nice Wendy. I don't mean a kiss, I mean a thimble. What's that? It's like this. She kissed him. Funny, Peter gravely. Now, shall I give you a thimble? If you wish, said Wendy, keeping her head erected this time. Peter thimbled the brat, and almost immediately she screeched. What is it, Wendy? It was exactly as if someone were pulling my hair. That must have been Tink. I never knew her so naughty before. And indeed, Tink was darting about again, using offensive words. She said she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you a thimble. But why? Why, Tink? Again, Tink replied, You silly butt. Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood, and she was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he came to the nursery window not to see her, but to listen to the stories. You see, I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys know any stories. How perfectly awful! Do you know, Peter asked, why shallow builds and the evens of the house is to listen to the stories. Oh, Wendy, your mother was telling you such lovely stories. Which stories was that? About the prince who could find the lady who wore the glass slipper. Peter, said Wendy excitedly, that was Cinderella, and he found her, and they lived happily ever after. Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor when they had been sitting and hurried to the window. Where are you going? She cried with misgivings. To tell the other boys. Don't go, Peter, she entreated. I know such lots of stories. Those were her precious words, so there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him. He came back and was greedily looked into his eyes, and now, which ought to have alarmed her, but it didn't. On the stories I could tell the boys. Oh, the stories, she cried, and then Peter gripped her and began to draw her toward the window. Let me go, she ordered. Wendy, do you come with me to tell the other boys? Of course she was very pleased to be asked, but she said, Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mommy. Besides, I can't fly. I'll teach you. Oh, how lovely to fly. I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then away you'll go. Whew, she exclaimed rapturously. Wendy, Wendy, when are you sleeping in your silly bed? You might be flying about with me, saying funny things to the stars. Oh, and Wendy, there are mermaids. Mermaids? With tails. Such long tails. Oh, to see a mermaid. He had become frightfully cunning. Wendy, he said, how we should all respect you. She was wiggling her body into distress. It was quite as if she was trying to remain on the nursery floor. But he had no pity for her. Wendy, he said, the sly one, you could tuck up in at night. Oh, none of us have ever been tucked in at night. Oh? And her arms went out to him. And you could darn our clothes and make our pockets for us. None of us have any pockets. How could she resist? Of course, it's awful fascinating, she cried. Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too? If you like, he said indifferently. And she ran to John and Michael and shook them. Wake up, she cried. Peter's come, and he is going to teach us to fly. John rubbed his eyes. Then I shall get up, he said. Of course he was on the floor and ready. Hello, he said. I am up. Michael was up by the time also, looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw. But Peter suddenly signed silence. Their faces amused the awful craftiness of children listening for for sounds from the grown-ups' world. All was as still as salt. That everything was all right. No, stop! Everything was wrong. Nana, who had been barking and distressfully all the evening, was quiet now. It was her silence they had heard. "Out with the light! Hide, quick!" cried John, taking command for the only time throughout the whole adventure. And thus, when Liza entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self. Very dark, and you would have sworn you heard its 3 wicked inmates breathing illegibly as they slept. They were really doing it artfully from behind the window curtains. Lisa was in a bad temper, for she was mixing the Christmas pudding in the kitchen and had been drawn from it with raisins still on her cheeks by Nana's absurd suspicions. She thought the best way of getting a little quiet was to take Nana to the nursery for a moment, but in courtesy, of course. "There, your suspicions brute," she said. "Not sorry that's Nana was in disgrace. They are perfectly safe, aren't they? Every one of the little angels sound asleep in bed. Listen to their gentle breathing." Here Michael, encouraged by such success, breathing so loudly that they were nearly detected. Nana knew that kind of breathing, and she tried to drag herself out of Liz's clutches, but Liz was dense. "No more of it, Nana," she said sternly, pulling her out of the room. "I warn you, if you bark again, I shall go straight for the master and the missus, and bring them home from the party, and they, won't master whip you? Just—" She tried the unhappy dog up again. "But do you think Nana ceased to bark? Bring master and missus home from the party. Why, that was just what she wanted. Do you think she cared whether she was whipped as long as her charges were safe?" Unfortunately, Liz returned to her pudding making, and Nana seemed that no help would come from her. Strained and strained until the chain at least had broke, and in another moment she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung up her paws to heaven. Her most expressive way of making the communication, Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once that something terrible was happening in the nursery, and without a goodbye to their hostess, they rushed into the street. But it was now 10 minutes since 3 scoundrels had been breathing behind the curtains, and Peter Pan can do a great deal in 10 minutes. We now return to the nursery. "It's all right," John announced, enduring from his hiding place. "I say, Peter, can you really fly?" Instead of doubting, trouble to answer him, Peter flew around the room, asked in the mantelpiece on the way. "How's Topping?" said John and Michael. "How sweet!" cried Wendy. "Yes, I'm sweet." "Oh, I'm sweet," said Peter, forgetting his manners again. It looked delightfully easy, and they tried it first from the floor and then from the beds, and they always went down instead of up. "I say, how do you do it?" asked John, rubbing his knees. He was quite the practical boy. "You just think lovely thoughts," Peter explained, "and they lift you up in the air." He showed them again. "You're so nippy at it, John. Couldn't you do it very slowly once?" Peter did it both slowly and quickly. "I got it now, Wendy," cried John. But soon he found he had not. Not one of them could fly an inch, though even Michael was in words of 2 syllables, and Peter did not know A to Z. Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless they had fairy dust blown on them. Fortunately, as we had mentioned once, as we have mentioned, once in his hand was messy with it. Almost he blew some on each of them, and with the most superb results. Now just wiggle your shoulders this way, he said, and let's go. They were all on their beds, and gallantly Michael let go first. He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room. I flew, he screamed, while still in midair. John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom. Oh, lovely! Oh, ripping! Look at me, look at me, look at me! They were not nearly as elegant as Peter. They could not help kicking a little, but their heads were bobbing against the ceiling, and in almost nothing as delicious as that. Peter gave Wendy a hand at first, but had to detest. Tink was so indigent. Up and down they went, round and round. Heavenly was Wendy's word. I say, cried John, why shouldn't we all go out? Of course it was to do that Peter had been luring them. Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took him to do 1 billion miles when Wendy hesitated. Mermaids, said Peter. Oh, and they're pirates. Pirates, cried John, seizing the Sunday's hat. Let us go at once. It was just at this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling hurried with Nana out of 27. They ran into the middle of the street to look up in the nursery window. And yes, it was still shut. But the room was ablaze with lights, and most heart-gripping light sight of them all. They could see in the shadow on the curtains 3 figures in the night air attire circling around the room. Not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3, but 4. In the trembling, they opened the street door. Mr. Darling would have rushed up the stairs, but Miss Darling signed to him to go softly. She even tried to make her heart go softly. Would they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them. And we shall all breathe a sigh of relief. But there will be no story. On the other hand, if they are not on time, I solemnly promise that it will all come right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time had it not been that the little stars were watching them. Once again, the stars blew the windows open, and the smallest star of all called out, "Cave, Peter!" Then Peter knew that there was not a moment to lose. "Come!" he cried imperiously, and soared out at once into the night, followed by John, Michael, and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late. The birds flew to coop. Till chapter 4, coming into flight. Love you. To the moon and back.